Speed limits. Maybe you love them, maybe you hate them. Regardless on your standpoint of speed limits, they are an important part of American history. Speed limits in the U.S. have been around longer than cars have, and they are a very important part of history due to today's prevalence of road travel. Throughout researching this speech, I feel as though I have gained a lot of information, and I feel as though I can talk about these topics accurately. Today I'm going to talk about early speed limits put in place to preserve gas mileage, and speed limits put in place to help safety. First, I will tell you about early speed limits. Connecticut was the first state to put into place a speed limit law in the year 1901. They had a speed limit in urban areas of 12 miles an hour and in rural areas of 15. After Connecticut put this law into place, it kind of got the ball rolling for other states, especially in the New England area, and a lot more states started putting in speed limit laws. By the mid-teens of the 20th century, around the World War I era, speed limits in many states were 20 miles an hour in rural areas and 15 in urban areas. And they continued to rise up until World War II, and they got up to speeds of around 45, 50 miles an hour. Once World War II started, in the year 1942, the U.S. government put into place a national speed limit that they called the Victory Speed Limit. It was so named because this speed limit they thought would help provide a victory during World War II. The speed limit was 35 miles per hour, which meant that nowhere in the U.S. could you go faster legally than 35 miles an hour. They put this into place to conserve gas and rubber to help with war efforts. And it was in place from 1942 till 1945 when the war ended. After 1945, speed limits continued to rise. By the mid to late 60s, speed limits were almost as high as they were now, seeing speeds of 65, even 70 miles an hour. Two states in particular, Nevada and Montana, did not actually have speed limits. They were known as non-numerical speed limits. Speeding tickets were handed out by officer discretion, which more or less meant there wasn't exactly a speed limit. Now, I will tell you about speed limits put into place because of gas mileage. By the late 60s and the early 70s, speed limits had gotten quite high, but then the oil crisis of 1973 hit. After this hit, in 1974, President Nixon signed the Emergency Energy Highway Conservation Act. This put into place, again, a national speed limit, this time of 55 miles per hour. However, this was pretty slow considering the advancements that cars had made over this time period. This cut funding to states that did not put in a 55 mile per hour speed limit. So while it wasn't required of states, if they didn't put it in without this funding, they could not keep their highways open, or the highways would fall into a state of disrepair. Montana and Nevada, again sticking with their land of speed stereotype, they developed laws to kind of tell the government that they didn't like what the government was doing. They put into a law that even if you were speeding over 55 miles an hour and you got pulled over, they would only give you a ticket ranging from $5 to $15, which even back then was not very much. And the ticket was labeled as an unnecessary waste of resources. And it didn't go on your record, no points on your record. So it wasn't a very serious infraction at all. The 55 mile an hour stuck around for 13 years until 1987, when Congress allowed states to raise it up to 65. Everything else about it was still the same. It still cut funding if states didn't keep it below, if states decided to raise it above 65. Now, I will tell you about speed limits that were put in place because of safety. From 87 to 1995, speed limits stuck at the 65 mile per hour mark. In 1995, President Clinton signs the National Highway System designation. This repeals President Nixon's original bill and allows states to set the speed limits for how they choose is a good representation of their state, and essentially just lets states choose their maximum speed limits. Montana, again being the land of speed in 1995, set a speed limit of reasonable and prudent based on the area and the conditions you were in. So if you were in the middle of Montana on a dry, sunny day on a nice straight stretch of road, you could probably go 100, 110 miles an hour. Ticketing was up to the discretion of the officer. In 1998, Montana had to get rid of this due to the law being quite vague. By the early 2010s, speed limits had risen above what their levels were even before the original act was put in place in 1974. Some states seeing as high as 70, 75, and 80 miles an hour. I now have a chart that I will show you that will show the maximum speed limit in each state. So this graphic shows the highest speed limit in each state. As you can see, most of the West Coast is around 70 miles an hour, and then a lot of the central area is 75 with a few 80s scattered in there, and then the West Coast is also 70 due to being not so many straight stretches of road. And I'll explain what's going on in Texas here. So today, Texas has the highest speed limit in the U.S. Many states around the U.S. have, about 8 states in the U.S. have a highest speed limit of 80 miles an hour. Texas has a 40-mile stretch of road between San Antonio and Austin where you are legally allowed to travel 85 miles an hour. Today we talked about speed limits in the U.S., starting with early speed limits because of gas mileage, and speed limits because of safety. Speed limits are an important part of U.S. history. Whether you love them or hate them, I hope you have learned something about speed limits today.